Well, I never. Thank you. Thanks for coming. TGIF, everybody, right? So I'm Carla Fernandez. I'm the co-founder of an organization called The Dinner Party. And I am, like many of us have, going to talk about the crisis of isolation. How many of you guys know this handsome face? This is Dr. Murthy. Couple hands. There's actually some people from his team here this week, which is awesome. So Dr. Murthy is the former Surgeon General of the United States of America. He was ousted by Trump. That's a presentation for a different conference. Won't talk about that today. But the Surgeon General's job in America is to kind of scan the body of the nation and understand, like, where does it hurt? Where are the areas that are in need of most healing in our country? The Surgeon General is the person who made smoking as tabooed as it is and started the fight against big tobacco. The Surgeon General has raised awareness about the AIDS crisis and gotten contraception into public use. This Surgeon General scanned the country and said the problem that we are facing that we need to solve is social isolation. This isn't some airy-fairy, touchy-feely thing. This is actually a major health crisis. He uses the word epidemic. So I'm going to share some of the stats that I think other folks have shared today as well, but we know that over 40% of adults in the US report feeling lonely. 50% have no one outside of their immediate family to talk about serious things with. We know that the American suicide rate has increased to 30% in the last two decades, especially for people between 10 and 34 years of age. It's the second leading cause of death. We know that loneliness and weak social connections can have the same negative health impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which I know I've kicked the 15 cigarette a day health habit. I hope you all too. But it's serious health impacts. And this isn't just old people that are cordoned off in retirement communities. It's the future leaders of our country. It's millennials. It's young people. People between the ages of 18 and 22 report higher loneliness scores than those people 72 years of age and older. I know this is light Friday afternoon content, but it's just like grounding this, and this isn't just a catchphrase. This is a real crisis. So it's created this dynamic in our country where we're all feeling all kinds of things, and yet a partner of ours, Parker Palmer, talks about this conspiracy of silence. We're all feeling these things, and yet we're not talking about it. We're going around at our conferences with smiles on our faces, giving our elevator pitches, and very rarely are we invited to actually talk about what's going on beneath the surface. And what's interesting about the crisis of isolation, and as we think about how do we actually fight this, how do we solve this, a lot of people assume this is a technology issue. It's because we're on our phones too much. It's Facebook's problem. They should be fixing it. But the science is saying that you could use social media not at all, or you could use it all the gosh darn time, and that doesn't impact your predicator of whether you're lonely or not. It's whether or not people have strong social connections and actual people with trusting relationships who they can connect with. That determines whether or not you feel lonely. So the work that I do is, let's not try to fight this problem with more technology. This isn't an app that's going to fix this. What's actually going to fix this is people having people they can turn to when they're having a hard day, people that they can talk to about what's actually going on. And it's about meaningful relationship building over time. So the question that I'm obsessed with is, what if we could each take the source of our deepest isolation, whatever the topic is that we feel the most alone about, and jujitsu flip it and use that to actually build the kinds of relationships that make us feel like we're not alone in this world. And this is an amazing quote from Dr. Murthy, who talks about the fact that we don't need surgeons like him to solve these problems for us. What we actually need is one another. We can be the medicine that each other needs. We can be the solution that people crave. We are all the doctors and we are all the healers. So that image didn't work, but doesn't matter. I would love to just experiment with this a little bit. You don't have to participate if you don't want to, but to take a poll of hands, how many of you here have ever lost someone that you were close to, so a parent, a sibling, a partner, or a friend, or know somebody who's lost someone? So you have a parent, a sibling, partner, or friend who's lost someone. Literally everyone. Okay, second exercise. Raise your hand if you have ever felt like you just don't quite know what to say to someone who's experienced loss or who is grieving. Or you're grieving yourself and someone says something and you're like, that's nail on chalkboard. So this is the crux of the work that I'm doing, is it's fighting the crisis of social isolation, but it's using the very specific intervention of grief and loss. Literally every single one of us will experience loss at some point in our lives. Many of us already have. And yet so many of us don't know how to talk about it. There's this sort of constipation that we all feel when we bring up this subject, and there's these moments that create space and gaps and awkwardness and isolation around a topic that could be this great unifier. And I'm interested in this topic not because I read a cool paper on it in an academic journal or because I saw a TED Talk about it. I'm interested in this intersection of grief and community and isolation because I lived it. This is myself and my dad and my stepmom in the last few months of my dad's life. When I was 20, he was diagnosed with cancer. When I was 21, he passed away. He was awesome. And what happened at that point in my life is that my girlfriends with whom I'd shared everything up until that point, the big questions like what do we major in and who do we want to go to homecoming with and do we go to Coachella weekend 1 or Coachella weekend 2, like the tough questions. Suddenly, I was asking questions about preparing for the end of life, what does it mean to live well, the reflections that come up when we face our mortality, and my friends weren't there with me in that same conversation. And I was trying to be an A+ student in dealing with my own grief, as I'm sure many of you would too, to-do lists, and let me just get it over with and go through all the steps. And as I reached out into the world to find support, I found that the world of grief support literally hadn't been updated since the early 1980s. It was a lot of teddy bears hugging. It was a lot of a child blowing a dandelion. And I know this is just the imagery and the aesthetic, but it kind of captures the vibe around how culturally we deal with grief support in our nation. I went to therapy, and it was wonderful, but it was a monologue. It was expensive. I went to a grief support group that met in the hospital of the basement where my dad had gotten radiation, which was the last place I wanted to let my guard down. And what I realized I was craving were spaces where I could hang out with people who were my age, who shared in my interests, who I actually wanted to be friends with, in spaces that actually felt good to talk about these big questions. And some of the questions were about the diagnosis and the death, but a lot of them were just what do I do when I'm on a date and someone asks me what my parents do? How do I talk about the fact that my dad died without killing the mood? Very practical, very 21st century. So I was so lucky to meet this woman, Lennon Flowers, who's my partner now in work and in life, my work wife, I call her. And we were working together at a startup at the time in Los Angeles. We'd been kind of elbow to elbow in this small office space for many months, and we went for a coffee walk one day. She asked me how I was doing, and I very honestly was I'm having a little bit of a hard week, and I shared with her that my dad had died earlier that year. And immediately was oh, I shouldn't have brought that up. She's going to think I'm the girl with the baggage. But instead, her response was, me too. Her mom had also died from cancer when she was 21. And before we knew it, we were back in the office, and we're kind of awkward high five, good talk. But we very much knew there was more to explore there. So Lennon came over for dinner one night with a handful of other people, and we talked about it. We talked about all of the questions that we held that we'd never been able to express. We talked about the funny stuff. We talked about the sad stuff. We talked about the changing dynamics in our relationship. And there were 5 other people that joined us there that night. And that group continued to meet over time. This is us, also grainy, but you get the point. So as this group got together, more and more people started to hear about these dinners, ask us if they could join. Therapists started to refer their patients to us. And Lennon and I looked at each other and were what? We're not professionals. We're just doing this because we need to do this for ourselves. It's what we crave. So over the course of the last 8 years, we have been slowly, organically, carefully, thoughtfully building what is now the Dinner Party. The Dinner Party's mission is to transform life after loss from one that's marked by isolation to one that's all about community support, making friends, and all through the art of breaking bread. And for whatever reason, we are the only organization, we're the only community in the nation serving this age group, 20 and 30-somethings, who've experienced loss. And ever since day one, we've always had more demand than we can accommodate. We have waiting lists in cities around the world. And I know some of you are like, I have a community with 1 bajillion people in it, and we're like crazy growth hackers, and it's gonna get even bigger, and that's awesome, and I have a lot to learn from you. We've been practicing the model of community building that's like very conscious, very intentional, very slow. And that being said, we're super stoked that we're now, we've found hosts, trained them, matched dinner partiers to tables in about 100 cities, mostly in the US and some international. We have 3,800 active dinner partiers who are coming to their table across 280 tables. And we've received about 10,000 long applications about why people are looking for a community like this. And when we started this, I felt a little bit like a control freak and didn't want to let it go. But the more people we have coming into this, the better the events are, the better the communities are. We now have a table that's all women of color in Washington, D.C. We have a table that's all comedy writers in New York City. I hear they pass a spliff around before dinner. Whatever works for you. They're creating their own rituals. Like, we very much open sourced this thing, and people are now taking this and making it their own. That's a birthday cake to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of a table that had been meeting monthly for a year. And we're hearing this from people. Before the dinner party, I was always the outlier. Now I found a place I belong, and I can't imagine life without my tribe. And to me, it's crazy and exciting that people are taking the hardest thing they've ever been through, and by putting it as the main course of a meal, building relationships where they finally feel like they belong. We're hearing that people would recommend us to a friend. 70% of people are saying that it's been a transformative experience for them. 88% have been saying that they feel less alone or less lonely around their loss. We're getting cool press, like the dinner party is like therapy but better. BuzzFeed recently said we were the #1 thing to do when grieving, which is not anything I ever aspired to build, but we've done it. And the big question that we're now holding is, like, we've built this model that can hold this kind of hard conversation. How do we find the other conversation killers, pun not intended, or the other sources of isolation, and use them as conversation starters and relationship builders? And how do we find what are the other forms of loss and the other isolating topics that we're not talking about, and use this model we've created to convene people around them? So we launched a project called the People's Supper, which was helping to bridge across lines of difference following the election. I think I've talked to a few folks who've attended this. They've happened. We had one last year in a literal abandoned coal mine in Colorado, all the way up to the Obama summit inauguration, and Barack and Michelle and Prince Harry all sat down to one of these. It was pretty crazy. We're working with an author who wrote a book about sexual shame coming out of the evangelical Christian community, and she's basically taking the model we've built and applying it to connect women who want to talk about their relationship to sexual shame in a very literal Me Too kind of a conversation. And we've also started to prototype some work around eco-grief and the loss and the hardship and the isolation that people feel as we live in this world of changing climate, both in specific instances of environmental loss from disasters and climate change more broadly. So that's what we're building, and that's what we're working on. And the next 7 minutes, I'm going to take you through 9 principles that will hopefully mean that for all of the dinners that we've hosted that have totally sucked, because there have been a lot, for all the times that we've fallen down and scraped our knees, I would love to just give you the things that we learned from them so that you don't have to waste your time and replicate them within your own communities. Sound okay? Yeah. Cool. Okay, so the one important principle to always keep in mind, I think a lot of communities are talking about self-care. How do we care for our community managers? How do we care for our community members? Always remember that self-care doesn't happen in isolation. Sure, you can put in your earbuds and you can put on a podcast about meditation and sit alone in a dark room, and that will help. And there's also another form of self-care that we all need to be practicing, which is in community with one another. This was a really big learning for us. Forget the first come, first served. What we all need to be doing if we're wanting to build the kinds of relationships that can be transformational for people is building circles of likely friends. So we've all been to this sort of one-off event that was interesting, and the next day we think about it in the shower, and maybe we email with one person we met, but like probably we never see them ever again. And when we started doing this work, we would have a dinner in Los Angeles, and the first 20 people who RSVP'd got their seats, but that meant that every dinner in Los Angeles, it was a different set of people. What we learned was that when it's the same group of people and they meet 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, they actually start to get to know each other. They actually build trust. They don't have to repeat their story of what brings them to the table. So dad, brain cancer, every single time. They actually get to build. And it's hard. Like it's way easier. It's way more efficient to just have like a one-off event or an open call. It's hard work to build circles of friends, but that's actually what's going to make the difference. Put away the folding chairs. Like, we've realized that young people don't go to the traditional support groups for lots of different reasons. We've had many different hospice agencies and grief support centers come to us saying, originally they were saying, like, good luck, the millennials are never going to come. We offer millennial support groups and nobody shows up. Now they're coming to us being like, what the heck are you doing? How do we get 20 and 30-somethings to come? And one of the pieces of advice we give them is like, get rid of the teddy bears in the corner, get rid of the circle of metal folding chairs. If you want to create a space where people feel comfortable and can be vulnerable, you need to create a space where they actually want to be. And oftentimes in these institutional medical settings, the metal folding chairs just immediately have people guard themselves. This is important, entering at a slant. The soul is shy. Our mentor I mentioned before, Parker Palmer, often talks about the importance of when you're asking people to talk about things of the soul, you can't just beeline right for the center. For us, it's a dinner, is what we call this third thing. People are actually coming for a meal. They're sharing food. They're passing plates. It gives them another thing to do to then make them feel more comfortable talking about harder topics. Other people use poetry as sort of a third thing to get people to talk about what they're really there to talk about. We know that if our organization was called the Grief Party, people wouldn't come. Specificity matters. We've tried to have dinners that are like, let's talk about isolation generally, or trauma generally. It doesn't work. What works is when there's a group of people who all have a shared specific experience, like I'm a 20 to 30-something and I've experienced the loss of someone that matters to me. Some of our tables are even more specific. We have a suicide loss table. We have a table that's formed for people who are now adults but lost a parent when they were a child. Specificity is super important. What's also important is the ability to use the we pronoun. I think we have found that being able to sit at a table and say, I lived this experience too. I'm not some like outside facilitator that has a neutral perspective and is just gonna ask probing questions, but like I, as the host of the dinner party table, want to be here too, is so critical, and it makes everybody feel like they're not being analyzed or guided, but they're actually in it together. And we also talk a lot about doing no harm. So obviously the work we do is in a sensitive subject area. And when we started to grow this community, we were nervous that we weren't going to be at every single gathering. They're now happening. Multiple dinners are happening on any given night. Most of our hosts we'll never meet in our whole lives. We'll maybe talk to them on the phone, or our community managers will be in a relationship, but we won't be meeting them. So a lot of our energy now goes into building the kinds of relationships where our hosts can come to us if there's an issue, if there's something they're worried about, if there's someone at their table that they're concerned about. And what's cool is that while we focus on keeping everybody safe, our hosts get to be creative and come up with the cool place settings and the new poem street at the beginning of dinners. And we've been so blown away by the creativity that they brought in. How many people have been working in a community setting and someone's like, just put it in a toolkit and put it online? Like, if we only all had $1,000 for every time someone has said that. When we started this work, we heard from a lot of people we really trusted who suggested, like, great, you've done these dinners, make a guidebook, put a PDF online, be done, move on to the next issue. If this kind of community built itself, if this kind of community responded to a toolkit, like I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have to be building relationships with people, having a phone number that they can call if they have a question. So I think we have to sometimes fight against the urge to just be hyper efficient in order to actually be effective. And I think toolkits are one of those things that can be a silver bullet, but don't actually solve the problem, which is building trust with real people. And then the last point that I want to make is I would love for you all to think about what are the ways in the work that you're all doing and the communities that you're building where you can take the pain and the experiences that are giving people a form of isolation, and how do you actually do that jujitsu flip and turn it into a source of power and a source of deeper connection. I'll end with a final quote from a dinner partier, and I'd love for you all, if this resonates with you, to reach out and join. We have one of our most active communities here in the Bay. But I love this idea from Alex in Philadelphia that coming to a dinner for her was a Wizard of Oz moment. She was stepping out of a completely colorless world and back into something that was richer and more vibrant than before. She felt like she could start reclaiming my life again. And I know that a lot of the last 2 days has been about metrics and data and how do we growth hack and the nuts and bolts of community building. And I wanted to end on this note just to empower you all to remember that the work of bringing people together is like some of the deepest soul work that you can do. And it's work that's needed now in our time than it ever has been before. So I would encourage you all to think about what is the Wizard of Oz moment that you're creating for people as they come into the communities that you're building. That's it.